It is a cold morning on the highway. Hope everyone's enjoying their spring break. I am actually on my way to the Planet Comic-Con convention where Dr. Brad Will and Dr. Scott Robson and I are giving our presentation on Star Wars in American culture. And I thought, because this is such a long ride and because I don't want to fall asleep, and hopefully that this all comes out right, that we could talk about Star Wars as a fan film and the importance of the fan film. And really, when we look at the importance of Star Wars, and one of the reasons why Star Wars has still kind of remained very solid is because of the support of fans and the fan film. Before we get into that, though, keep in mind that all genres, westerns, horror, romance, sci-fi, they all at some point devolve into parody. So that brings up the question, what is parody? Parody is when we take a humorous look at something, we poke fun of a genre, a style, a look. After The Matrix, so many people parodying or using the motion, the bullet time effect to some extent. If you look at the universal monster craze, the Mummy, Dracula, those kind of creatures, you look at Young Frankenstein as a perfect example of parody. You look at westerns, for example, and you see Blazing Saddles. And Blazing Saddles is, again, another perfect example of parody. Even Star Wars has had its own parody in the form of Hardware Wars, or even Mel Brooks's Spaceballs in 1987. I guess the point of a parody, though, is parodies are the industry poking fun at itself. Young Frankenstein, Spaceballs, Blazing Saddles, the Twilight Saga. All of these are just basically poking fun at the genre from the industry, and it generally signals the end of that genre's popularity for that time. Now, granted, monster movies will come back, horror movies will come back. Everything is cyclical and has a cycle to it, and the parody is always a good sign that a particular genre's popularity is starting to wane. I mean, look at the parody movies themselves. This is not a horror movie, comedy, whatever those things are. They're really bad. They're actually parodies of parodies to a point. But you get the point of where the genre is going to, or with the inclusion of the parody. Interestingly, there are actually adult film parodies of popular movies. More on that in a little bit. So this brings us into the question of a fan film, and what is a fan film? Well, fan film by definition is a film or video that's inspired by popular television show, book, literature, comic book property, even movies, and the fans go out and create their own content that's based in that universe or based on that property. Now, fan films have been around for a long time. I didn't even know this myself. But the earliest fan film goes all the way back to 1926 with the Anderson Hour Gang, which was, and I guess there's only one copy left in existence in North Carolina. But this was essentially a couple of filmmakers who really liked Hal Roach's Hour Gang series, the precursor to The Little Rascals. And they created their own series or created their own film and released it. And fan films have been going on ever since, through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, today. Many of the early fan films really get their start from amateur filmmakers who are in film school. But there have been a lot of celebrities who have created their own fan films. Hugh Hefner, Andy Warhol, those are just a couple of the people that have made films based on their favorite properties, which is really kind of unique and interesting. What's fascinating, though, is you do have to keep in mind this is all copyrighted material. Copyright material that these filmmakers don't have permission to use. So why do it? Well, that's where this interesting concept of participatory culture comes into play. So participatory culture is one that the consumer isn't just there to consume the film, to watch the film, the television show, read the comic, whatever that may be. Instead, they're there to contribute content or act as producers themselves. We often refer to the concept of a prosumer, not quite a professional, not quite a consumer, but somewhere in between, as the type of people who will create fan films. When we think about participatory culture as defined by Henry Jenkins, there are a couple of things that fall into specific categories that make the participatory culture work. The first one is the low barrier of entry to creative expressionism, meaning it doesn't cost a lot to create a fan film or fan fiction. The other one is this notion that people really want to create and share their work with other people. Now, this is really important because the film creator, someone like George Lucas, has shared his creation with us. Now we're sharing our creation with someone else, and so on and so on and so on. Oftentimes, participatory culture involves some kind of mentorship where someone with little experience is working with someone with greater experience, or going to places like theforce.net to learn about how do I make my fan film, what do I need to do, and how do I make it seem like it fits in the Star Wars universe. Probably one that kind of borders on the ego realm of participatory culture is the fact that my contribution is going to have some kind of impact, or that it matters to the overall whole of this this universe that I'm creating. And the final one is there has to be some kind of social engagement, some kind of social connection where the user contributes and then there's feedback from their work. I think that's really key when we look at the fan film today. Even though fan films have been around forever, there was no such thing as the internet back in 1926 when the Anderson was producing the Our Gang series. Today it's a lot more different. So with that in mind, fan films then serve as a way for us to express ourselves, to connect with others in our society, to connect with others who have like minds as ourselves, and provide some kind of feedback, some kind of interaction, so to speak. Fan films can even start that social interaction online. Just about every popular item today has a rabid fan base, and generally has fan films made out of it. I mean, you look at Star Trek, you don't see a lot of those, and we'll talk about why in just a little bit. Doctor Who, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, just about every comic book property out there has a fan base based around it, and they can, and often do, create fan films. But again, these properties are copyright. The copyright holders could sue you to oblivion. So why do people still think that they can get away with why do they think they can still get away with making these films and distributing them? This is where the idea of fair use comes in. And I'll tell you, I am not a lawyer. I've never played one on TV, although I did play a copy boy in a made-for-TV movie in the 1980s. That's neither here nor there. But what I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to get at is I'm giving you an overall view, and it may not be exactly 100% correct of the law. And if you have further questions about the law, you really, really, really need to contact a lawyer, specifically a copyright lawyer, because when we talk about fair use, this is where things get really sticky and get really complicated for fan film creators. You know, and I'm going to kind of read a little bit here as we go here. And it's really not a safe thing to do when you're driving, but it's 6 a.m. and, you know, the roads are fairly empty. The U.S. government has a statement on fair use that basically sections 107 through 118 of the Copyright Code outline what fair use is, gives you four important pillars of whether you can judge something as being fair use or not. And this is what is used in the court system should ever any kind of copyright infringement claim ever come up. So the first pillar in fair use and helping to define whether something is fair use is the purpose and character of use, including whether or not this is being used for commercial purposes. So in these kinds of situations, one has to prove that you're not making any kind of a financial gain from the use of this material. And generally, when we look at this first area, we really are talking about, is it being used to enrich or inform the public? And in these cases, this is where education gets away a lot of times with photocopying chapters from a book and distributing to a class, or copying an article out of Time magazine, or even using clips from a video in class to share with you. This is all part of the educational tenet of the Fair Use Act. The second pillar in the fair use law is the nature of the copyrighted work. This section really looks at the copyrighted work from in the general interest kind of category. So for example, the Zapruder film, which captured John F. Kennedy's assassination in the 1960s, was eventually sold to Time magazine, to Time Life Books, to Time Publishing. They tried to copyright their work, but when others tried to reproduce the film for other films or use it into text or whatever, Time magazine tried to sue, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And at which point the Supreme Court said, "Oh no! This film, the Zapruder film, is so important to our public interest, to our public knowledge, to our society, that you can't copyright this work for your own sole money-making gains. This is something that belongs to everyone." In commentary, I think that this is probably one thing that the court should look at in greater detail, especially when it comes to what do we as a culture and a society own. Point number 3 is one that gets a lot of people into trouble, and this is the amount and substantiality of the material used in the copyright claim. Is it okay to copy an entire chapter from a book and just give it away? Is it okay to use, a minute and a half of a song that's only 3 minutes long? That's what this pillar looks at in the fair use law. How much is used, and how much of an impact does it have in the overall outcome of the copyright owner to make money from their work? So a really great copyright fair use law was from I think it was a Lyndon Johnson biography. I forget whose it was. But essentially, the person who was writing a review or making a commentary on the book lifted one paragraph from an entire book of 600 some pages. And the book's author and the publisher decided to sue because they felt that one paragraph pretty much summed up everything else in their book. And by republishing that one paragraph, it really watered down that publisher's ability to make money off of that book. The publisher won in this case. For bloggers and people who work online like myself, it's often okay to use one paragraph or 40 to 100 words from another article, providing that you have attribution. That means here's where the original source of information came from, here's where you can read to do more. But this substantiality and amount and how it impacts the copyright owner's ability to make money is really, really important. In cases where money is involved, where the copyright holder says, hey, you've lost us money, it's up to the copyright holder to really prove that they've lost money and how much money they've lost before the courts will even consider any kind of damage or whether this is a lawsuit that's even worth the court's merit. The fourth one kind of ties back into the third. How much money could the company have potentially lost by you creating this fan work? And again, that's up to the copyright holder to prove. fair use law is really crazy. The government even goes on so far as to say, hey, just because we weighed in on this case in favor of the copyright holder, or in the case of the person who's created the new work that they claim is under fair use, doesn't mean we're going to do it that way every single time. And so anytime someone claims fair use, it always gets into a weird, sticky situation. I don't know what that was. And just because you acknowledge that, you got this information from this website, or you're saying, hey, thank you, George Lucas, for giving us Star Wars to use, or thank you, Marvel, for giving us Captain America, we really love it. And just because you're giving attribution does not mean that the copyright holder has given you permission. Those two are two very, very different things. When in doubt, always ask permission, because you don't want to end up on the wrong end of a lawsuit stick, or in the case of some copyright holders, waiting until you're into production and then forcing you to stop after you've spent sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. That's not a good thing. So always ask permission. Ultimately, the copyright holder has the final say, not the fans. So even if you love something to death and the fans say, hey, we want this, if the copyright holder says, I don't care, you're out of luck. So let's bring this back around to parody that I mentioned a moment ago. Where does parody fit into all of this? Generally, as we define, parody is poking fun at something, and in the process, you are creating a new work. And because you're poking fun at something, you're providing commentary about something, the courts generally give parody a pass. I say generally, but not always. The courts generally give you a pass on something that's labeled as parody. They don't necessarily give you a pass on something that's labeled as satire. Satire is a little bit different than parody, and you have to be a little bit more careful in how you define that work. You really should look up the definition, or maybe I'll pop it up right here. Know the definition between parody and satire, because that's what the courts are going to do. And once you know this definition of those two terms, then you begin to understand why the adult film industry over the last couple of years has been very successful about taking well-known properties like superheroes, Star Wars, famous celebrities, and then making parody adult films out of in the process. So when we look at movies like Star Wars, a XXX porn parody, one wonders, well, how can they get away with it? Well, we know the definition of parody, and we know the definition of satire, and Vivid Entertainment and Axel Braun have specifically said that this is a pornographic parody of the Star Wars universe. Because of this, courts and lawyers and companies generally don't want to get involved in this kind of activity, because parody, even though it's defined, could go either way, and the courts could end up the companies could end up spending hundreds, if not millions of dollars on a lawsuit. So until somebody, like Disney, for example, wants to take Vivid Entertainment to court, they're going to continue to produce adult parodies. For those of you that are really, really interested, I've included the trailer for the Star Wars adult film parody in this lecture. It's safe for work. There's no nudity. It may or may not be very funny, but you can compare and look at this trailer and see for yourself if you think that this would constitute parody or not. One of the earliest parodies of Star Wars came in 1978 with Hardware Wars. This was made for less than $8,000 and ended up making over $1 million in its initial run. And for 1978, that's pretty darn good money. The director, Michael Wiese, went on to write a number of books because of his success with this, a number of books for independent filmmakers on how to budget, how to market, how to distribute, and how to produce really low-budget independent films. So in the case of Hardware Wars, it actually had a positive impact for this creator. Now, whether you think the adult film parodies are legitimate works or not, or whether you consider Hardware Wars a legitimate work or not, they are professional productions. They are legitimate works of art, film, whatever, that have a budget, that have a crew, that have a big distribution outlet. So these are not fan films, but I think it's important that we point out these two specifically because they do relate to Star Wars and because they do contribute to this idea of participatory culture. If parody is protected, and we see fan films being made all the time, where do the copyright holders stand on the use of fan films or the creation of fan films? That is a really good question. Each copyright holder tends to treat their work very, very differently. For example, Paramount, they'll sue at the drop of a hat. They'll send cease and desist letters. They'll send their lawyers after you. They'll send down takedown notices. And in the case of Star Trek, we see very few, in relation to all other genres and other properties, we see very few fan films created in the Star Trek universe because Paramount will be there to shut you down or to keep you from distributing your film. Warner Brothers and Marvel, now owned by Disney, Marvel and DC don't specifically go after people to shut down their fan films, but they also don't openly encourage it, I guess, to a point. I guess probably the best example of what comic book companies do comes in 2003 when a filmmaker by the name of Sandy Cholera created, it's like a $40,000 production, created a fan film called Batman Dead End. And in this video, Batman is fighting aliens from the Alien movie and Predator from the Predators movie. And it was a huge success. It looks sharp, and many people would say that it's one of the best examples of Batman on film. This was shown at the San Diego Comic-Con in 2003 and rocketed Sandy to huge success. His follow-up fan film that he was going to produce was called World's Finest, and it had Superman and Batman in it. And instead of telling a complete story, it was more of a what-if trailer. And we see a lot of these what-if trailers going on today. The very next year in 2004, Warner Brothers, DC Entertainment just put their fist down on top of Sandy and told the San Diego Comic Convention that, hey, we don't want you showing fan films anymore. So Sandy was prevented from showing the World's Finest trailer anywhere at the show. Years later, actually, it's probably about 2005, 2006, so not a whole lot later, Sandy and I were exchanging emails, and he basically said that Warner Brothers had lawyers following him around the San Diego Comic-Con show floor just to make sure that he didn't pull out a portable DVD player and try to show it to anyone. So why would Warner Brothers, why would DC go to all the trouble to follow a guy around at the comic book convention show floor? Well, I've got my speculations. Fans just went so nuts over this film, especially with the actor Clark Bertram, who is playing Batman. I mean, he physically looks the part of an Alex Ross Batman. And people were saying, Clark, this is the guy that should play Batman if DC ever decides to make another Batman movie. Well, one of the reasons that you may want to shut down the production of any future work from Sandy is because DC was in the process of making another Batman film. And if fans did not take to Christian Bale as Batman, they could have lost a lot of money. And so they quashed that, and in 2005, we got to see Batman Begins. I'm not saying that there's a correlation there or any kind of relationship or cause and effect, but it seems kind of ironic or interesting that we prevent you from showing your movie in 2004, and our movie comes out in 2005 because it's already in production. For Doctor Who fans, the BBC, while it owns the character of the Doctor, they give the rights to the writers if they create a new character, a new creature, or a new monster. So while you won't ever see the Doctor appear in a legitimate or authorized fan film, you will often see many of the creatures and the monsters, including the Daleks, Cybermen, and those kinds of things. You know, Community created its own, the television show Community created its own parody of Doctor Who with Inspector Spacetime. Some of you may be familiar with that. One of the actors who played Professor Spacetime went on to try to create a legitimate fan film based on Inspector Spacetime and his adventures in the red telephone box. And he went and did a Kickstarter campaign, and everything looked like it was good to go because, you know, he was simply what many people perceive making a parody of Doctor Who. The problem is Professor Spacetime is actually owned by Sony, and for the Community television show. So they had a lot of their money already raised for Inspector Spacetime, and suddenly Sony steps in and says, no, you're not. You're not going to do it. There's something going on up here. I don't know what that's about. There's some big accident ahead. This is exactly what I don't need. This is exactly what I don't need on my way to a comic book convention to talk about Star Wars. Well, actually, it'll probably help us out. I'm stuck in traffic halfway between Salina and Junction City. So we all want to create fan films, right? I mean, who doesn't? Who doesn't want to create their own and tell their own story about their favorite property? So I went and did some research and contacted some companies to find out what their official position is. In 2008, DC Comics president Paul Levitz said that as long as people aren't making money off of our properties, then we don't care. We're not encouraging it, but you know, we're going to go ahead and allow it without getting people in trouble. In 2009, Paul Levitz was moved to a different position. Diane Nelson became the president of Warner Premiere, which controls DC Comics, and there was a lot of changing going on between the between publishers and whatnot. And so it isn't clear on what DC's stand is right now. I haven't heard of them stepping on anyone who is trying to create a fan film, but I also haven't seen a lot of big DC-related property fan films in the last couple of years either. There's always Batman stuff, and then if you go to the YouTube channel Bat in the Sun, you'll see a lot of it, but I haven't really ever seen anyone come down on that. Bat in the Sun, I do believe, got a takedown notice from Marvel Studios on one of their more recent projects. And Marvel, because now they're owned by DC, it's really up in the air about what you can do with any Marvel property. So if you're wanting to do something with Captain America or Wolverine, you have to be kind of super careful about that. I had a good exchange with Dark Horse Comics in 2011. They're the company that used to own the Star Wars publishing rights for comics. And now they own Hellboy and Ghost and Captain Midnight, among a lot of others. I had a really good email exchange with them in 2011. They said, our stance is make as many as you like, seriously. The only issue comes into play when you're looking to monetize or distribute them. However, I hope they are not turning people around. If you're talking YouTube, our stance is make as many as you like. Seriously, the only issue comes into play when you're looking to monetize and distribute them. However, if you're talking YouTube, we're more than happy to see fan participation. LucasArts runs its own show. If they don't like something, they'll tell you themselves. But for the most part, go to town. That's a pretty good endorsement from a publisher. Speaking of Lucasfilm, George Lucas loves fan films. I think he understands participatory culture a whole lot. You know, for years, George Lucas, Lucasfilm, Atom Films embraced the fan culture by putting on the official Star Wars Fan Film Awards. These ran from 2002 until 2012. And what was great about this is that Lucasfilm gave fans access to official sound effects and music and imagery that they could use in their fan films to say, go on and create, embrace. Lucasfilm doesn't produce and doesn't host the fan films anymore. They came out and said, we're really looking for ways for fans to embrace new ways of sharing their love of the Star Wars universe. Now, again, one could point fingers at conspiracy and whatnot. What the hell is this dude doing? Holy crap, dude. You know, one can point fingers at conspiracies and whatnot. But it's interesting that they stopped doing the fan films in 2012, and in 2013, Disney announced that they were buying Lucasfilm. Why do I keep pointing fingers at Disney? Well, Disney is pretty sue happy. They like to sue people and protect their copyrights, which they have every right to do. I think sometimes, though, from a fan perspective, they get a little bit out of hand. One of the earliest fan films, Star Wars fan films that I remember, came out in 1997. It was produced by a man by the name of Kevin Rubio, and it was a mashup of the Star Wars universe with the popular television series Cops. It's really, really funny. It was really, really creative. Kevin was working for the Fox Kids network at the time. He's since gone on to become a very well-known writer. If you have read the Tag and Bink series, Tag and Bink Are Dead, published by Dark Horse Comics, you can see his humor as these two Rosencrantz and Guildenstern characters are running around the Star Wars universe and experiencing events from a totally different perspective. It's really, really cool. This thing was so popular online that it's often credited as the resurgence of the modern fan film. So what makes fan films a thing? What makes it even possible to do fan films? Well, years ago, if you wanted to do a fan film, you had to spend tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars to get camera gear, lighting gear, buy film stock, pay for processing, and then find some method of distribution to get your fan film seen in theaters or wherever that you were going to show that fan film. A lot of that changed in 1995 when the DV, the digital video format, was introduced, and later all the different variations of that. I remember seeing DV video for the first time in 1995 when I was at Atlanta. We visited a Sony down there, and they showed it for the first time. People were like, "Oh, this will do nothing. This doesn't meet broadcast specs." And the Sony people were like, "Oh, really?" Because CNN has been using our little mini DV cams in the field for over a year now. I have no idea what's going on. And I think you've seen the results of the DV video movement. You now had, instead of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars for a camera, you were spending maybe several thousands of dollars for a camera, maybe $5,000 instead of $20,000, which meant that it was affordable for people to get access to the gear. And along with the digital video tape and the digital video method of capturing content, you also had desktop editing. You could go use an off-the-shelf computer, shoot your video and edit your video, and then put it onto a DVD and put in special effects with software that would run on these systems. In a sense, the means of production, or the barrier to entry, had come down so far that people were able to produce really great content at an extremely low budget. And for families, you could go out and you could buy a $500 mini DV camera, and many families did, to capture family outings, get-togethers, whatnot. And it totally revolutionized the way video is done. And for people who grew up watching the original Star Wars movies, or for families who had recently seen episodes 1, 2, or 3, going out and creating a fan film was really, really easy, especially for kids who have nothing to do over the summer. And that's where we get introduced to Ryan Wiebe. One of my favorite Star Wars fan films is Ryan vs. Dorkman, which really has nothing to do with Star Wars, but everything to do with lightsaber battles and fighting and so on. This was done in 2003 for a website called theforce.net, which we've already mentioned before. You can check out how the Phantom Menace and really the Attack of the Clones influenced the work that Ryan was doing. So just as an aside, way back in the day, when I used to write for the company in California, I used to produce and write a ton of tutorials on how to shoot something, how to do a special effect, how to do whatever. And oftentimes I would use Star Wars as a hook, or Star Trek as a hook, to getting that done. And it was amazing how popular these tutorials were. In fact, theforce.net linked to a lot of these. And so my connection to Ryan is that on his website, years later, I would see that he would credit me for learning how to do some of the effects that and processes that he used to create his fan films. Shortly after his Ryan vs. Dorkman movie was released, Ryan was hired by LucasArts to work with them. He left them in 2004 to go work for another company, and in 2009 he won his second Emmy for compositing work for the television series Heroes. So we have the barrier to entry dropping off. We have people making fan films. But I think the last thing that prevented fan films jumping and being as prolific as they are today is putting video online. In 2000, if you put up a video that was larger than a postage stamp, it was impossible to get access to. It took a long time to upload. It took even longer to download on a 1.5 megabit connection, internet connection. And if it was popular, you ran the risk of crashing your site or your server or the entire hosting company that was hosting your website. It was crazy. Then in 2005, a company by the name of YouTube was formed by three people who had left PayPal. And I think we've seen what's happened with YouTube ever since. Now we have a way to create content cheaply and easily, and to upload it essentially for free at a super high quality. And with faster and faster internet speeds today, we can download 4K movies and stream them from our computer. This is why fan films have become so popular and why they're so important to social commentary. Today you can go online and you can see hundreds, if not thousands, of videos created in the Star Wars universe. Some of them literally have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in the production of their piece. Others look like they haven't spent as much, and it kind of shows. But there are some good ones out there. I'm going to link to some of them down below for you to check out. I wish I knew what was going on. Even though there's all these Star Wars films out there, even though we have the means of production have been lowered and we can put up our movies and share them with the world, they can all be taken down. All somebody has to do is contact YouTube and say, we don't want these Star Wars films online anymore. So what's the answer? Well, I think the easiest answer is to try to do something called an authorized fan film. An authorized fan film is where you actually work with the company or get permission from the company to produce the work. Those are few and far between because, again, authorizing a fan film could open the door for a lot of other people to create without authorization. If you authorize or acknowledge a fan film, you could get into trouble of saying, well, this is canon or not canon. It's really kind of a mess. So you don't see very many people doing authorized fan films. What's the future of Star Wars and the Star Wars film franchise? As I mentioned multiple times, Disney owns Lucasfilm now and owns everything related to Star Wars, and Disney does like to sue. They do like to maintain and keep as tight a control over their property as they possibly can. And I think that could potentially lead to problems with fan filmmakers. We haven't seen anything just yet, and Disney has taken kind of a hands-off approach to Marvel, but they may not have the same feeling in a few years when the next Star Wars movie comes out. This is kind of one of those wait-and-see approaches. My hope is that they kind of embrace the spirit that George Lucas created with the fan film and let fans continue to create with very little hassle. So I'm stuck in traffic, and we're just waiting to see if I'm going to make it to Kansas City or not. Got about 4 hours to my presentation. I'm not even to Topeka yet. So now here's your assignment. In the discussion forum, for those of you that are on Blackboard, or use the comment section below if you're watching this some other place, I want you to take one of the following positions. You can either take the position of A, Disney should prohibit all future Star Wars fan films and take down as many as possible to protect their legally owned property, or B, Disney should encourage future Star Wars fan films. I want you to take one of those two positions, and then I want you to provide as much detail as possible to justify your stance on either one of those positions. Thanks for watching. Thanks for paying attention. Hope you've enjoyed the fan films that I've linked to. Hopefully I'll make it to Kansas City.